started working with Margie Jenkins informally in 1970, 71, something like that. I had moved to San Francisco. Margie, who comes from she's a fifth generation San Franciscan, had been in New York working with Morse Cunningham for many years, and she moved back to San Francisco when that phase of her life was done. I had been very interested in the dance scene in New York. It was a very vital, multidisciplinary thing in the 60s and on, indeed through the 70s, with dancers collaborating with painters such as Bob Rauschenberg and others, and with writers, Jackson McClough, and others. And it seemed a very vital overcoming of, let's say, the boundaries between disciplines, which happens at moments of ferment, artistic ferment, like Paris in the teens, that sort of explosive thing where writers, painters, dancers, composers all decide they should get together, make trouble. So I had been very much interested in the same area of dance that Margie Jenkins was, which is to say, the Judson Church people, very experimental, exploratory work that Doug Dunn, Yvonne Rainer, and others were doing. And so we had similar interests, but I had no technical background in dance, just an interest in it. It was not always the easiest thing to see. It was an art very much like poetry at the margins in those days. Cunningham was almost only working in Europe and some in Latin America. There was nothing for him in this country. I had come to know John Cage's music quite well, but John again was someone whose work you could only see intermittently, and then people were sitting there throwing tomatoes at him, and so that made for an interesting visual field. Didn't seem to bother John at all. In any case, we had that milieu, and so when Margie first proposed an early collaboration, it seemed to me very, very interesting, potentially, but neither of us knew where it would begin and what we would do in a collaboration. And so we started to think about the places where the so-called two disciplines of writing and dance intersect. And we realized, of course, the obvious thing, which is that they have a great deal in common in terms of uses of time, rhythm, duration, and I began to look also at some things that had been less examined, which is word as gesture, language as gesture, and gesture as language, so that there was this meeting place that seemed possible to exploit. And naturally, form is form, so that the coming together produced interesting notions of anti-narrative, formal ebb and flow in space. So that was really the starting point, and we started working on a small scale, obviously in lofts or whatever spaces became available to us in San Francisco, and then in New York at various little alternative venues, Morse Cunningham Studio, etc. And gradually, over the years, as the company became known, we began to work in larger spaces, as some people do, and began to then expand the notion of how you work with larger technical things at hand, greater technical potential at hand, and also how dance changes from working in an intimate loft space, which is wonderful, to a large proscenium stage or whatever. So in relation to all of that, of course, ideas began to evolve over time. And we really made one rule of collaboration, which was that we would never duplicate the form of the collaboration, or seldom duplicate the form of the collaboration. We would reinvent it each time. And naturally there were visual artists involved, like Bruce Nauman and others, and a variety of composers. So the main composer we've worked with in recent years is a man named Paul Drescher, who's a generation of John Adams and others, the sort of post-minimalist generation.
You began this collaboration with Margaret Jenkins early in your career and early in her career. Mm-hmm. So in some ways your work is woven together, although each of you have done collaborations with many other artists, and there have been years when you haven't collaborated. Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of the way that this work with her dance company has affected the development of your writing?
Yeah, I have a sense of it. I mean, it's a somewhat an intuitive sense of the early effects it had on my work, which was to make me more cognizant of the physicality of poetry, the use of breath, the use of space in poetry, the projection, even when you're not performing poetry aloud, as we often do nowadays, the fact that space is there conceptually whenever you are playing with utterance and playing with language on the page. And that definitely began to make, I think, maybe my work a little more expansive and a little less interiorized. I can sometimes get lost in thought. I still can. It brought a dimension of gesturality, perhaps, and certainly a kind of new form of address, an evolving rhetoric. Now, it might have evolved in a similar way without that work, but I think in making texts for dance, there was an impact that I encouraged in a way on my own work, though there were different kinds of texts for the most part. Occasionally we would use something from a book of mine, an actual poem, but most of the time I wrote texts when I was writing texts for dance. We didn't always use words in the pieces. Sometimes I would work on structure, I would work on coordinating the collaboration between the composer and visual artist or Margie, and I would just be in an advisory capacity, but sometimes it was a much more hands-on thing, working with the structure and working with sometimes side role.
Margie Jenkins mentioned to me, in the context of sort of why she, over the years, has continued to collaborate with you, even with this premise that you both share, that you want to make it new each time, that it isn't about repetition, but rather discovering something new. And she said that your language your use of metaphor has a riveting impact on movers, dancers, on the way they responded. She referenced Slipping Glimpse, the work that you did prepared for India, or in collaboration with an Indian company. And a phrase, I believe it was, breathe into the bone.
Not quite.
Breathe along the bone.
Breathe along the bone.
Breathe along the bone.
Yeah, that was a text we gave them. The dancers are very interesting readers of text. They're obviously not, for the most part, happily, not academically trained readers.
Right.
So they read in a way through the body for what it will give them, the way some painters do, will read through their eye. They'll take a text of mine and read it completely differently from a literary and likewise dancers. And so they will bring things out of a text into their bodies that may not have a literal relationship to the meaning of the word, but will be a physical secondary response. And of course, all of these texts we learned early on do have a rhythm that you can dance to. You can, just as you can to music, some more than others, but so that there's an actual, so that the music of the text can be scored to choreography as well. So that was an interesting discovery. But yes, the dancers they give remarkable readings that I think only dancers will give of the work. And sometimes they're very private readings. I'll say, how did you get that duet from that text? And they'll say, well, it reminded, this image reminded me of that, and we started to move, and it's a wonderful kind of alternative interpretive mechanism that they have.
I was looking at Mezza Voce from the series for Anne-Marie Albiac and Parcel of Glass, and I recognized a thread that's come up recently also.
Yeah.
Does he incline his head to become calligraphy, memory of his body's desire for the moving letters of an alphabet of intractable geometry, Ariadne's thread as the trickling of warm blood? I know that your new collection of poetry coming out is called Thread.
Right.
And I was interested in your, relationship to the concrete. There's that tendency of abstraction and the two poles. And I think of a kind of longing for bodies and figures of some sort that cannot be achieved in poetry, but can, for instance, perhaps in dance in a certain way.
Yeah.
And that there's that kind of complementary moving back and forth. But I was also interested in the notion of Ariadne as a possible choreographer figure, who spins a thread, weaves a web of sorts. But it's a very thin line between the material and the immaterial.
Creates a path.
Yeah.
Yes, guides you on a path. She is a choreographer, through the darkness. And so that figure began, I guess as early as that, if not earlier, to become something of a preoccupation. And of course we did a dance piece called Thread for the 75th anniversary of the San Francisco Opera, where we used a poem of mine from the New Book, Say 4, I think it was, Say number 4, to begin and to more or less conclude this take on the myth of the labyrinth and so on, the Minotaur, which is such a myth overburdened with interpretation and artistic, of course, undertakings over time, endlessly, that we were a little hesitant to go into it, but I think that the readings that I was involved with at the time meant that we could go where we wanted. I have shied away from myth in the modernist sense of the myth of Goya, of Joyce and Pound and some of the later Olson and Duncan and others, because I thought this has been burned to a crisp. But lately I felt a freedom with certain of those figures that touch me very deeply in terms of a life path. And so that was one of the figures that began to emerge as I thought through the question of the Minotaur and this secret, this monster, chimera, if you will, but at the heart of the path that we take, at the heart of the labyrinth, if you will, the dark wood in Dante's sense. And this figure who is contra natura, who is the joining of animal and human, a result of a sexual congress that overturns the civilized. So therefore, as a secret maybe that we all bear forward of our pre-civilized selves, the psyche, the part of the psyche that cannot be easily spoken. So all of that began to be of great interest to me, and I put a way to work on it then through the abstraction of dance, really, and then the quasi-abstraction of some poetry. Mine, as you note, a little bit like Stevens, moves back and forth between a certain physical concreteness and a certain level of abstraction that, if not, isn't exactly philosophical, but is parallel to philosophical thought in a way.
Well, I mean, there's also that hybridity of lexicon, sort of a semi-colloquial and a really profoundly philosophical. Those threads running through at the same time. You might also find in Stevens differently, like an anecdote of a job.
Yeah.
Sort of this juxtaposition that's kind of silly.
Of the completely everyday, commonplace, rejectamento of daily life, and then another tone. Yeah, that's a dynamic I think that goes all through the book. And it's maybe I'm just a bouncing ball in the pinball machine, moving among these levels of language that I don't really want to exclude. I mean, I love Frank O'Hara's idea of the poem including everything.
But I was very interested in talking with Margaret Jenkins, how often she referred to your work as narratives, and how your narratives were giving cues to the dancers. And that what I then understood is that you have been doing writing specifically for these collaborations that is not published, except for the dance performances in various forms. And that you also have poems that perhaps you can elaborate whether you wrote them before, during, for, and those poems become part of your books, if not sort of the centerpieces of a particular book-length thread.
Right. Yes, various. I think for Margie, she's taking narrative in the broadest sense of narrati, of the telling. I think the texts I use for dance, first of all, that are purely for dance, sometimes do come much closer to actually storytelling, to give an interesting background of narrative to the work, the dimension of narrative to the work. Not everything. Sometimes we use purely lyric words, but it's a broad sense of what narrative is, as in one of these texts you'll see. And yet, as it turns from word to body, in a sense, the dancers then do narrate, do create a telling in juxtaposition with language that they each fill one another out, so to speak. Which, when writing in dance, words in dance are very, very tricky to work with, to create a balance, so that language doesn't overwhelm, for example. Language makes its demands, and we found over the years that there are ways you have to tune language to dance such that people's brains are melting down as they try to do two things at once. For some people it's not a problem, but for a lot of people it is. Watching and listening. Different, obviously, than watching dance and listening to music, which is abstract in much the same way that dance is abstract. So we've used different strategies to create some kind of harmony between the two, or disharmony if we want it, but to make a balance, to make a structure that's viable, that doesn't fall apart.
And I wanted to say one more thing before you read a couple of these texts, which is we kind of located this gesture, or this of a sort of movement from secret into story.
Yes.
And I also I was looking at a text that Dominique Fourcade, the French poet, had written when Merce Cunningham and Pina Bausch died within 6 weeks of each other in the summer of 2009. And he talks about the lament and the mourning for the choreographer, and that what we have left is the dancers and the choreographer's traces.
Yes.
And I was wondering to what extent you identified with the role of the choreographer in this process as a poet of collaborating with a choreographer.
Well, I mean, there is something deeply interesting and moving about the fact that a dance is for performance, and it vanishes into the air when it's done. Curtain comes down, lights go out. It's over. Naturally, you can have another performance at some point, but it is a very mortal art. Poetry can, as Merce Cunningham at the end of his life said, poets and painters get to have their stuff continue in a way that choreographers don't. Even if they're petit pas or classical choreographer, it's changed dramatically over time. There is no original anyway to be preserved, though now with film and so on, you can have a better idea what the original was. But okay. So I'm very aware of the almost heroic evanescence of dance and of the sacrifice the dancers make of a pure part of their lives to this art that has, in a sense, no future except the art itself. So Merce's company now is in the second year of touring after his death, after which they will disband. There'll be versions of his work performed here and there around the world for however long, maybe forever, or whatever forever is. But we've seen even now that when Merce is not the presiding guide to the bringing back of his work, the recovery of his work, that something dramatically changes. And if it's not also his company working, the phrasing, everything alters. So that can be interesting, but it's not the work in itself. Well, poetry, too, over time. We read Chaucer, however, hundreds of years later, very differently than a contemporary audience read or heard Chaucer. Even the language of Middle English has become distant, in a sense. Even the language of Shelley has become distant, in a sense. Both in terms of the evolving of the language and the evolving of poetic effect. So it's not entirely different, but we do have the texts. The libraries don't all burn.
What's that?
The libraries don't all burn, though many of them over time. I'm very conscious of that fact about dance. I'm very interested in it, very moved by it. And it becomes a representation in a sense of the mortal coil, and the dedication it takes to make a work for the moment, or a succession of moments, if you will, but for the moment is extraordinary. I'm very, very interested. And so I've always liked the idea of these texts vanishing into the air. That I'm not worrying about the page. I'm not worrying for the most part. I'm only worrying about them occurring in space and then disappearing with the dance. And that, I think, creates other demands, other possibilities. This is the prologue to a work we made with an Indian dance company. It's called The Sleeping Dance, the dance. We made it in 2006. We made it in 2004 or 5, and it was first performed in 2006, I believe. And it's the prologue to the work. And as it goes along, dancers begin to filter into the space, and the light begins to come up on the space. I refer at the beginning, and it sets a kind of thematic frame for what it is to be working in company, so to speak. What it is also to be traveling as a company. You're not in one place. You cross borders. You go into foreign cultures. that's a very fascinating thing to have done over time, to present your work in Prague or Brno to an audience that doesn't know your vocabulary in particular. So it sets a little bit of an ambience for that, and a mood. The only other thing I would refer to is that the quadrichord here is a musical instrument, an extraordinary musical instrument invented by Paul Drescher, the composer we were working with, 14-foot long linear thing that can be bowed or used percussively or endless different ways, and he also hooks it up electronically, and so it's almost an orchestra in itself. A Slipping Glimpse, prologue. The 14-foot quadrichord, has it begun to sound? Has it begun to fill the recesses of this space with sound? The dancers are still for the moment, if dancers are ever truly still. Even when waiting, they are not still, since movement is also within. Still and stir. Movement waits impatiently to appear, still and still stirring. Invisible movement hesitates as dancers wait to begin, between inside and outside, between the dark and the light, between beginning and ending, departure and return, like and unlike, silence and sound, one and many. And then you descend, carefully you cross over here to there, you cross into the form of things, its unfolding, where secrets exchanged become stories, where what was hidden is to be disclosed, past and future meet, and you are not the same from here to there. Borders, boundaries, watchtowers, and perhaps you will glimpse what others have seen, the gilded gates and sleek avenues, the mourned cities, remembered rivers and fields, idle ships, battered harbors and shores, the ruined palaces and libraries of our endless folly, the books strewn and burned, the shop windows and market stalls, people conversing in a welter of tongues, a confusion of tongues, people racing and idling, phones at their ears, bills changing hands, dark eyes peering through the dust of history and the dust of stars. Should we pluck the long strings? Should we begin?